If Doom was the goriest and most controversial for computers, then Mortal Kombat was the goriest and most controversial for arcades and a good few home computer, console and portable conversions. The world was greeted with Street Fighter 2 a few months before Mortal Kombat was unleashed by Midway and Taito in 1992. As I said in my Street Fighter 2 ports video, it seemed back then like you were either into Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter. Personally, I chose Street Fighter, but it's undeniable how superior Mortal Kombat looked at the time in terms of realism through its digitized presentation. The added bonus was some sickening and disturbing death moves, which caused outrage with some politicians and parents at the time. These could not seem to understand that these were just games. Let's be honest, a kid who wanted to shoot ice out of his or her hands and thought this was possible should have had some kind of help in the first place. Likely, Mortal Kombat was a scapegoat to blame many issues onto a single subject, so it's nicely justified. Just like every other arcade game, we've got several different ports for home console, so we're going to begin this by looking at the worst to the best.
Excellent.
Now, I tend to look at this OG Game Boy conversion as one of the worst around. Firstly, it controls badly, collision detection is way off, without a doubt, and visually, of course, this isn't a stunning looking game. Not back then, nor is it now. The idea of Mortal Kombat was to bring realism and brutality. This is where this version epically fails. Of course, in terms of realism and that digital look, of course, the Game Boy was by far up to the task given its monochrome display, plus its inability to provide a proper digitized look. This was a poor attempt and by far not very much fun to play on this 1993 release. Johnny Cage is also not present in this port. That's down to limitations and size of Game Boy games at the time. Pulling off special moves is also problematic due to only having a couple of action buttons on the OG Game Boy. Users of the Game Link cable could hook up this to another Game Boy and multiplayer could be achieved. Although this is quite an upgrade from the Game Boy version, it is still a portable 8-bit system, and so it faces some severe challenges. Having said that, despite this version being in colour, it also plays much better too. When I was hitting opponents, every hit counted and didn't seem like a major problem at all with collision detection. To be honest, this version is a huge upgrade. The music production also sounds a little better too. Both Game Boy and Game Gear had 2 action buttons, yet Game Gear's version just seemed easier to use. Kano was not a selectable character on the Sega Game Gear version due to memory and size of Game Gear games back then, and sadly we've only got 2 stages on the Game Gear version. To be honest, the Sega Master System is pretty much similar to the Sega Game Gear version. Of course, only the Sega Master System was for a television set rather than the portable. This again is a fairly stripped down conversion, which is understandable given the Sega Master System's limitations. So for example, we only have 2 stages to play from, just like the Game Gear counterpart, and Kano is also removed in this version. Blood and Fatalities is in this version, and apparently most of the moves found in an arcade game, and that is one of the issues with the Mortal Kombat with only 2 buttons, is it's very problematic to pull these combinations off on 2 buttons, much like the previous 2 versions I've covered so far.
Fight.
Although this conversion for the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis is the best so far in this list, was it actually really that great if put back to back with the arcade original? Although many owners of this console had this game back in the day, it came with some drawbacks and some flaws too, so really far from perfect. In this version we'll find particular missing background images such as clouds moving in the background, and even one stage which is missing a moon, amongst other things. As you play through this port, you'll notice little parts that actually aren't in it. On top of that, some textures in the game just look really terrible. It's by far the prettiest looking version of our beloved fighting game, but at least this version felt good to control, and like this machine was man enough to partly handle the challenge of this game. Get over here. Now, what can I say about the Commodore Amiga's port of Mortal Kombat? For one, it's likely one of the best arcade conversions on the platform, and secondly, I feel that it looks as good as the Mega Drive version and plays just as well too. Just like the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis version, the Commodore Amiga also has particular imagery missing, which is understandable, and even more so for a 16-bit microcomputer. I am pretty sure that if you were still using an Amiga back in 1994 when this released, you likely would have been very pleased with this, considering some of the god-awful Amiga ports that I've covered so far in this series. Not much more really to say about this port, as it really does largely reflect the same as the Sega Mega Drive version. I only rank this one in a higher place because I'm a Commodore geek. I think back in the day you likely had arguments over which version was the best, the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis, or the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom version. If we take a look at the Super Nintendo version, in my opinion the game looks so much better on SNES. It just looks smoother and not as overly pixelated as the Mega Drive version. In addition to this, many stages on this 16-bits conversion had background imagery included, such as clouds and moons. Having said that, the SNES version did have some cutbacks, although I don't think it's as significant as the 16-bit Sega's conversion. For example, the SNES version has a scaled down palace in the Palace Gate stage, and you could also argue that shadows on the Sega Mega Drive port look a little better than in this version, but really that is just being nitpicky. The main criticism with this port is the lack of gore and blood, but this is Nintendo after all. They certainly had different standards back then. Really, at the end of it, SNES and Mega Drive ports both have good and bad limitations, but both control equally just fine. Today we have the PlayStation that gives us an inevitable Pro version after a few years. Back in the early 90s, Sega gave us the Sega Mega CD. Now without a doubt, this conversion deserved to be here in this list at this point. The difference between this version and the stock Sega Mega Drive or Genesis version is that this version has almost had a remaster. Sprites have been given a makeover, so red outlines aren't so obvious in this. Textures in particular, stages have been cleaned up too. There are still some missing elements such as clouds here and there, but generally you could consider this as an HD remake before HD became a thing. The audio has also got a boost too, but it sounded much fresher and louder, and rightly so. This was on a Mega CD. They named it Mega for a reason. And in first place, I put in the DOS version of this. So why did I rank a mere IBM PC compatible game in first place for a change? Well, this version truly was superior in many ways. At this point in PC gaming, games were beginning to come into their own on PCs, with massive, groundbreaking achievements being hit with games such as Doom, just for starters. Providing you had a very good computer back in 1994 and a very good sound card, you could really see the differences in most games, which was also on consoles. What improved DOS version even more is that this game came with Mortal Kombat 2 on CD-ROM when it was released, and gave it even more of an uplift than its original floppy disk release. Not arcade perfection at all, but certainly close to it, and certainly a very nice version of it to play too. It's very unlikely that a vast majority didn't have a top-range computer back in 1994, but if you did, without a doubt, this was the version to go for. Anyways, that's it, and just remember that this is my personal opinions of my particular favourite ports of Mortal Kombat, and by no means this is an official list, so please no squabbling in the comments over that as usual. Anyways, until next video, thanks for watching.
Finish her. Raiden wins. Johnny Cage wins. Fight!